So I hope that you can hear me now. Dear colleagues, good evening to everyone. Welcome to the Center for Urban History at the lecture within the program The Source as Your Choice. When compiling this program in the spring of 2022, we were thinking on what does it mean to create the sources in war, what does it mean to talk about violence when this violence is actually surrounding you from all the sides. What does it mean to think long term? What does it mean to pass these or those decisions? Because our research is a set of major decisions that we make, starting with the questions we ask and then going over to the sources we address to find the answers. But we also understand that those decisions are built into the sources, because one day someone decided that this or that source or this or that text, object or image are worth being preserved. And it was with this approach to identifying and creating the sources of the war, of the sources about the war, and not only this war but the other wars that we used to have in our region and outside our region. This is the approach we have taken, and today we will speak about a specific source type which is related to the experience of forced displacement. And I'm happy to give the floor to Dr. Emily Channell-Justice, the head of Tamarty Contemporary Ukraine program in Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. And since 2012, in a certain way, she has been working in Ukraine and with Ukraine. She was here at the beginning of the Euromaidan. She had a study dedicated to student activism, and therefore Emily decided that something really important is happening around her, and this research ended up in the book Without the State, Self-Organization, Political Action in Ukraine, and soon you will find this book in the library of our center. This is a book that was published in 2022, in that year that was really a turning one for all of us, and she got the award from the Ukrainian Association of Ukrainian Studies, which is another proof that this is really a good book that is worth reading. And today Emily will tell about her research that she started thinking about in 2021, and again it developed not quite the way it would have developed were it not for the full-scale invasion. Quite the same as the research and student activism developed in a different way than it would have in case there was no Euromaidan. In case you need interpretation to understand the lecture better, you can take the headsets for simultaneous interpretation. Sophia, my colleague, is there. She will give you the headsets, and there will be simultaneous interpretation provided. After the lecture, there will be a Q&A session, and the comments can be also delivered by you in the language which is more convenient for you. Suppose there is an air alert, and we understand that this is the reality of our times. We have the shelter below, but suppose you feel safe enough, we may continue. And this is a guide about the decisions that we have to pass in the conditions of war. Different decisions, not just about the sources, but about life, health, and well-being. So, you know, before the event, I asked Emily how I should introduce her and what shall I stress. So, besides being a social anthropologist, we have found that she likes cats. So, suppose our cat Mushka gets here, we could get distracted for a while, but just for a while.
It's a pleasure to give you a mic, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you, Natalia, for the lovely introduction. I really am pleased to be here and speaking about this research and taking advantage of the source as choice theme to dig into some questions about sources and methodology. I decided to present to this audience the kind of framework of this research that I'm working on and my methodology, and part of the reason for that is because there has been so much phenomenal discussion directly from Ukraine, from this center, among other institutes and initiatives, about the questions of methodology and how war changes methodology, but also how context changes methodology. Questions about positionality are important in this. So instead of presenting you with excerpts from the data itself, which I have and can share and I'm happy to talk about, I decided to bring to you a discussion of methodology, some of the challenges that I feel I'm facing with this research, and hopefully you can share some insight from your own perspective and your own work. So I thank you in advance for engaging in this conversation with me. As Natalia mentioned, I started working on this research in 2021. I started a little in 2019, and then it was disrupted by COVID and ended up in Ukraine and Kyiv in 2021. And I had planned to come back around April of 2022 to continue working with some of the organizations that I had started with at that point, which of course was all kind of derailed following February 2022. And so now I have a kind of what I like to think of as bracketing, right? This research starts in 2014. It changes dramatically at the end of 2021. So how do we move forward from there? As an anthropologist, as an ethnographer, I think we're faced with the question of how difficult it is to do the kind of ethnographic research that we were trained for as anthropologists in the context of war. Not that anthropology is not possible, and not that ethnography is not possible, but this idea of the long-term embedding in small communities, building rapport over time, and that sort of thing, we have to rethink that. As I mentioned just a second ago, Ukrainian researchers are working on so many incredible documentation projects related to the full-scale invasion, and this has really changed my thinking about what is most important in the kind of data that I have. And then I'm also thinking a lot about usefulness, right? How does my pre-2022 research contribute to the discussion of documentation? But with this theme of displacement, forced migration, this is a conversation that's already very rich, and many Ukrainian social scientists from a lot of different backgrounds have worked on this extensively. So what does my particular data set contribute to that conversation that hasn't been said before? And it isn't just filling the space of production of academic material. I think a lot about Jennifer Carroll's essay. For those of you, I don't actually know how it might resonate among Ukrainian readers. For those, I think, US and non-Ukrainian ethnographers who were very deeply connected with Ukraine, and through our ethnographic research, she wrote an excellent essay kind of about doing ethnography, and this quote, when I was rereading it, kind of stood out to me. Ethnographers trade in stories. We soak them up, we give them structure, we spread them in the name of shedding light and giving voice. If we do not have stories, it is hard to know what we have at all. And I was thinking about this in the context of this research. I'll tell you a little bit more about the specifics of the data that I have. Usually ethnographers control the stories a little bit. We ask the questions ourselves, right? We know what story, we don't know where the story will go, but we know what kind of story we want to tell, and we usually have some kind of relationship with the people telling us the story, so that we know the universe of the story. And Jennifer's essay is about some of these ruptures when we lose control of the story, we lose control of ourselves in the story, and I think that's something that really, the essay is obviously it's from 2022, but it kind of re-resonates, right? You can go back to it and read it again and kind of think something new. And just by the way, I decided to include some photos from Euromaidan protests that are, some of them are featured in my book, some of them are not, but just to give a little bit of visual context, that's what you're seeing in the background. So thinking about stories, thinking about representation, thinking about voice, I don't have to tell you about all the wonderful documentation projects that are happening. Here's just a sampling of them. So in addition to these more public projects that you certainly know about and many of you are already engaged in, I've also read and reviewed yet unpublished articles that are reflecting on these projects. So they're thinking about the influence that the war in Ukraine has had on Ukrainian researchers, how that has influenced their thinking about methodology, and how this is a major contribution from Ukraine in terms of social science. So some of this discussion suggests that the contribution coming from Ukraine is less some huge theoretical conceptualization, but more methodological shift that builds empathy into more of the way that we do research, or that builds positionality into the research in a different way. And I will be really delighted to cite those articles once they're published, but I think the fact that they're in this kind of review process shows how new and how immediate some of these conversations are. And so I've been thinking a lot about those in the context of this research. Documentation projects aren't just about gathering a data set that's for something, right? Sometimes we don't always know what the data is for, or what's good data, or what's going to happen with the data when we're gathering it. And I think that can be difficult as an ethnographer anyway. You just sort of have to follow what you think is interesting. But in my particular case, I find it's even more difficult because most of my data is actually research that I didn't do myself. So let me tell you a little bit about the data set that I have. So I'm working mostly with 3 data sets about displacement. The biggest one is 80 interviews with internally displaced people and volunteers and employees who worked at Caritas in Ukraine between 2014 and 2016. They are featured in 3 cities, Lviv. Most of the interviews from Lviv are 2014. Interviews in Dnipro in 2015 and 2016, and interviews in Kyiv in 2015 and 2016. So these interviews were all done by a Ukrainian anthropologist who is doing her PhD here in Lviv. She's originally from Horlivka, and in 2018 or 2019 she moved to Poland and started working in a service sector, and her visa would no longer let her work with research, and she said, I have these interviews, would you like them? And I said yes. So she basically gave me interviews to work with, and this is someone who I still have a relationship with, and we've talked specifically about the usage of the data, the ethics of the usage of the data, protecting the anonymity of the participants, that sort of thing. But I don't know how many of you have ever been an anthropologist who then inherited data that you did not collect and then tried to make any sense of it. It has thrown me off, let me put it that way. My previous research, of course, was about activism. It was with a kind of small group of deeply engaged political activists who I knew very well. And so the interviews that I did, you know, I knew what was happening, right? I could think about them really deeply, and this is all new material. There are so many times that I listen to these interviews and I think I really would have asked a follow-up question there, but I didn't and I can't, right? There's no continuation of that story. So that's the kind of first roadblock. So my second set of data is 7 interviews, which is a very small number, with volunteers and employees of Ukrainian and international non-governmental organizations that I completed in Kyiv in 2021. So at this point in this research, I was really interested in the kind of protraction of displacement, right? 7, 8, 9 years of displacement, and we still have these humongous, well-funded international and national NGOs that are working on displacement with really no offering of a solution, right? We're still talking about emergency measures. No one's sure what status is useful, right? There's a lot of questions that kind of remain the same. And I had intended to come back in the spring of 22 and not only continue working with some of these partners, but also attempt to do some more research in a city closer to the then front lines to try to get a different sense of the experience and concerns of displacement, not in Kyiv, right? Not in the capital. Obviously, that's something that did not happen, so that I have 7 interviews, and that's kind of what I have. And then I have also spent some time collecting Ukrainian policy documents that cover state policy related to IDPs. So of course that starts in 2014, and most recent changes before 2022, right? There's changes in 2021 to those laws. And so I have some kind of policy related questions that I think are interesting. But again, you know, we have that bracketing, right? 2014 to 2021, everything becomes different. The stakes are all different, and the policy stakes are different after 2021. So what's in the data? I thought I would give you, instead of giving you samples from the interviews, I thought I would give a little bit of a sense of the questions. So these are questions that appear in almost all of the interviews. So what event prompted you to leave? How did it happen that you came to the city that you're doing this interview in? What was the experience of moving? Did your whole family leave? What did you leave behind? The interviewee almost always asks about people's experience with state institutions. Were they able to interact with government services? What was that like for them? There are many questions about benefits for IDPs. So are people registered with IDP status? What has that done for them? What do they think of those benefits? Has the state helped you? Do you place any hopes on the state? These questions about the state are very interesting to me, that kind of how people relate to the state and how, you know, state services are meant to serve citizens of the state, and does that happen, does that not happen? That was one of the questions that oriented me toward this research in the first place. And so the kind of disconnect between IDP's reliance on the state and the state's often inability to provide services is a big theme of these interviews. Another question is why people chose Lviv, Kyiv, Dnipro. As you can imagine, the answer to this is often about existing connections. People knew somebody in the place, or they had lived in Kyiv before, those sort of answers. And then questions about how long people plan to stay, if they think they'll return. You can probably guess most of the answers are, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. I would love to go home as soon as possible, but I don't know when that will be, right? So I think to me, these answers, maybe the data kind of saturates relatively early. A lot of these answers are repetitive. Not that people have the same experience, but they all have the same sentiment. I don't know what the future holds. I'm staying here for now. You know, I often feel like the state hasn't helped me. Those conversations come up a lot. So I've worked through over half of the interviews, so fully listened, transcribed, done some sort of organizing of themes, and so that kind of first level of analysis has led me to some conclusions, which I've gone into a little bit, and I'll tell you about them before telling you a little bit more about what's in the data. So I thought a lot about this concept of emplacement. So we talk a lot about displacement, right? But then emplacement is not exactly just the other pole of that, but a kind of idea that helps us see displacement in a way that's more realistic, I think, in terms of the actual reality of displacement, which is very often much longer than what people actually anticipate. And so I was thinking about emplacement in terms of services and long-term decision-making. So this is a concept that comes from Aisha Chaylar and Nina Glick-Schiller's 2018 book that kind of approaches the question of not just the experience of displacement, but also how do displaced people build their lives in their host communities, and also how do residents of host communities respond to displacement. I know that there is a lot of great literature already addressing some of this, right? So I'm not presenting this as it's the only time anyone's thought of this, but it is something that in these interviews this comes up a lot, how people are received in their communities. Almost always I find in the interviews people say, well, I was welcomed really well, and then they'll tell a story about somebody teasing them for speaking Russian, or saying like, wow, I can't believe you're such a patriot all the way from Luhansk, sort of saying things that like outwardly the people in the interviews might not say they felt. Might not say that they felt like they weren't being included, or they were being excluded, or being judged by their origins, but then they would always have some sort of story about how they were kind of put on the outside a little bit, or they knew somebody who was, right? Somebody couldn't get an apartment because their registration said Donetsk. So this emplacement question, I think, especially in the context of very protracted displacement, that concept kind of helped me think about this a little more. It also helps me think about these questions about access to state services, or in this case often the absence of access to state services, because that becomes a part of people's connection or detachment from their host community. When people are not able to access state services, they have to look somewhere else to find help for the things they need. In the context of these interviews, a lot of times this is the Caritas organization. That's something that they came to from one way or another, and that served them and helped them. That organization had a lot of people who were displaced themselves, or who were actually from the Donetsk Caritas office, which got displaced to Ivano-Frankivsk and then redisplaced to Dnipro. And so this charitable organization, because it was disconnected from the state, and because it was, it was run in a lot of ways by displaced people themselves, it was more approachable. It was understood as safer, more friendly, a place where you could actually ask for help and people would treat you with respect and empathy. So I think this question about, where does the state sit within this universe of service and help, and what people need and how they make decisions, that tells us something about emplacement, about how people can integrate into a new community or not integrate, and then it also tells us some about how the state sees the potential reintegration of those occupied territories, which is separate from this conversation, but also not separate from this conversation. And one of the things, I'm sure, I'm telling you stuff you already know, but these questions about access to housing and jobs really impacts IDP's possibility to make long-term decisions. which then impacts how they see themselves in host communities. If people can get a job, they're more likely to be able to pay for their own housing, and then they're more likely to integrate into a new community and stay longer, right? Again, and this is very contingent on if people are able to get a job, if they're able to get housing, right? And what kind of services they're able to access. So this is kind of my first base level of analysis based on mostly on these interviews and some policy analysis. But 80 interviews, many of which are 2 or 3 hours long. There's a lot of material there, so I want to tell you more about what's in them, and then hopefully think with you and get some response from this audience about what's interesting and what's missing, and kind of how to go from here. So what else do people want to talk about? They want to talk about their hometowns. I have never actually been to Donetsk, unfortunately, and so something that has been really particularly interesting for me is to listen to people describe this city in 2012 and 2013. I had some Ukrainian language or Ukrainian speaking students who helped transcribe the interviews. And one of them's from Lviv, and she said she's never been to Donetsk, and she said she had no idea that such a place existed, right? That it had Ukrainian language speakers, Ukrainian cultural sphere, how vibrant it was that people talked about it, and so to me the fact that it was so striking, to a student who is, I would have thought she would have known, right? And so that to me was really, it's really beautiful, and it's really touching, and it's really, to me, it's something that has been lost, and that I think is. I don't know that this is unique to this data, but those stories really impact me a lot. Many of the interviewees were participants in local Euromaidan protests, especially in Donetsk, and they talked so much about how important it was to participate in these protests, no matter how small, no matter how much they don't consider it to have been victorious, they didn't think it had any impact, but it was so important for them to participate. And by the way, for many of them, that's why they chose to leave. Many of them had experiences of having to escape after learning about threats against their lives and their families. But there is that kind of politicized element to some of these interviews for people who are very politically engaged. They often talk about what it means to be Ukrainian. Sometimes the interviewer asks them directly, what does it mean to you to be Ukrainian? And this question is the one I am most surprised by. The diversity of answers is fascinating. I mean, especially for an anthropologist who I'm the type of anthropologist who believes, you can say whatever you want, but I want to watch you do it. And if you're going to tell me you're a feminist and then treat women like dirt, I'm not going to believe that you're a feminist, right? And so it's really interesting to listen to people kind of describe what they see as being Ukrainian, and some of them describe it also in a similar, like, it means taking action, it means doing certain things. For me, I don't know if these people do these things. I have to believe that they, that that's what they do when they tell me that's what they do. And so to me, that's a really interesting, it's an interesting question. The diversity of answers is different, and then believing what people are saying, and believing that they're judging others based on what they're saying, I think that's really fascinating. There's a lot of conversations about reconciliation with currently occupied territories, whether that's possible. Could you ever live with your neighbors again after knowing what they have believed, what they've done? Again, much more diverse answers than I would have anticipated. Especially, by the way, in 2014, this is one of the things I'm hoping to kind of track once I get through the whole material. Does that answer change between 2014, 2015, 2016, right? Is there any kind of shift in how people answer these questions over time? And I already talked a little bit about this relationship with charitable organizations and those individuals who were helpful. People in these interviews almost always want to make sure that people get recognized, that someone who has helped them is like named as someone who was helpful, because they're so appreciative of the help that they were able to get, especially from places they didn't expect. So that's just some other themes that I think are really prevalent in this data. I'm also really thinking a lot about what's missing in this data, and there are limitations to what's represented in the data. The main thing to me that's missing is the representation of state actors who are responsible for implementing the government's policies for IDPs. I tried. I got no responses. I got not no response, but we will not talk to you responses from my request to these ministries to talk to me. They were absolutely not interested. So that was one of the reasons that I was hoping to do some research in a smaller city where maybe the barriers to access to bureaucrats would be a little bit less. I did apply for a Fulbright to work in one of the ministries. The U.S. Fulbright program has this kind of public policy fellowship where you get placed within an existing ministry. Unfortunately, that would have been for 2022, 2023, so the program was suspended. So I have no idea, you know, if that would have actually worked. That was my thought for kind of getting around this problem. But I think it's a real gap. I think it's a real absence, not just having, you know, we have the kind of policy position. We know what the government says it thinks, but what were people who actually were responsible for doing these things actually doing? How are they actually interacting with displaced folks? And I don't know if that's data we can ever get. I would be really interested to have more perspectives of IDPs who are closer to the contact line. We do have this information thanks to amazing scholars like Tanya Bulak, Natalia Stepanyuk. That's just two people who are based, you know, on my side of the Atlantic, who I know have done just really spectacular work. And some of them were doing work in 2014, 2015. So while a lot of movement is happening. And so I'm really, and I should say Alexandra Tarkhanova has done amazing work right on the contact line and talking to people who went back and forth a lot. So there's a lot of really fantastic existing data about this. So I'm a little bit less concerned about the absence of this in my own data. But I want to, the last kind of limitation, I don't know if this is a limitation. You can tell me if you feel this is a limitation. My data has a real overrepresentation of people who actively consider themselves pro-Ukraine, right? So we know that a lot of people who left the occupied territories didn't necessarily do it because of political beliefs, but it's often an economic question, right? It's often a question about, you know, specific services, specific kinds of care that are needed. This data is almost all people who say in the interviews, I wanted to live in Ukraine, especially this huge overrepresentation of people who participated in the Donetsk Euromaidan. There are 3 or 4 people who are part of the Donetsk branch of the Svoboda Party, which are just absolutely fascinating interviews. Many of them are Ukrainian speakers. They spoke Ukrainian in Donetsk. They were active in the Ukrainian sphere in Donetsk. And so I think this is, I don't want to call it a limitation, but it is not a representative sample by any stretch of the imagination. And so I wonder if it's enough to recognize that and move forward and just say this is what it represents, it doesn't represent everyone, or if it's, you know, too partial of a sample because these stories come from this specific type of person. Now on the other hand, we spend so much time insisting on the fact that a lot of people are displaced not because of political views. It's almost rather interesting to have a sample of people who are very much displaced because of their political views, right? It's almost a correction for a previous correction of its own. I don't know, maybe I'm speculating too hard there. And I want to think a little bit about what can we do with this material, since it does have these gaps, it does have these limitations. To me, like I said, returning to these stories gives us a really intricate picture of this region that was, at least in kind of North American Slavic studies, deeply understudied. Shamefully, in all honesty. I mean, I can name on one hand the number of American researchers who have spent any time in Eastern Ukraine, let alone like done systematic research in this region. And that's to our own detriment. And so that's, one of the things I like about this data, just on its own with little analysis, is that it's adding some complexity to our story. I hope that this material contributes to this task of giving Ukrainian voices primacy in the descriptions of the events of 2014, which are often like really overshadowed by bigger picture stories, like what happens afterward, all these things. And I kind of came to this conclusion that it actually does not matter whether what these people are saying in their interviews is actually correct. So many people are absolutely sure that the people who came to Donetsk and occupied the regional administration building, they say they're not locals. Some of the details, I think that's probably true. I think there's enough people who say that and enough other data that I've seen that that's true. But some of the details that I read in these interviews, there is absolutely no way to confirm whether or not that's true. But I don't know that it matters, right? Because it matters for that person's belief of what's happening and where they sit in relation to that thing that's happening. And to me, that's almost more interesting and more important than, some very deep, like me, confirming somebody's story is correct or not. I don't think it matters, especially, 10 years later, right? We know this can be confirmed for sure. And then I'm curious about how this data can contribute to the development of policies in Ukraine that might serve internally displaced people. Can we learn something from mistakes and absences in the policies from 2014 to 2021? And what can we learn, especially if we're in this position where we're lacking the perspective of the people who wrote and implemented those policies, which is, you know, one of the big gaps in this research. So those are just some of my kind of thinking about what could be done. I have some ideas about the next steps and things that I'm thinking about moving forward. I'm working on listening to the interviews and working through the transcripts of the last 20 or so interviews. So I'm like nearing the end, but also feeling very far from the end of this data. So I'm thinking about, like I said, you know, the limits of the data. Full-scale war changes the nature of internal displacement. It changes the stakes about the conversations of displacement. Ukrainian IDP policy was already limited before the number expanded so greatly after 2022, and so, you know, can this data say anything helpful given what has changed since the data was collected and since I've started working with it? I'm thinking a lot about how the material makes a new contribution to this topic, which is, as I mentioned, really rather well studied. I think it's interesting on its own, right? I think these interviews are just fascinating, but you can't just write a paper and say, look how interesting, and get it published. That's just unfortunately not how it works. So like, what is the bigger contribution? I'm thinking a lot about how best to highlight the voices and narratives of the people who are interviewed, kind of the storytelling component, to go back to Jennifer Carroll's essay. Even though I can't give any ethnographic detail about them, I can't go back and interview them again. And to clarify a little more, I know almost nothing about them. That was something that we agreed with the interviewer, was that she wouldn't tell me any of their details about their names, where they ended up, what happened to them, because she was very concerned about protecting their anonymity and their safety. So I know their age and usually the town they were born in and the town they came from, and that's all that I know. And so, you know, usually, right, if you're writing some kind of ethnographic study, you're going to describe a little bit, like the site where you met them, what you talked about overall, right, like do they like cats or not. I don't know any information about this, about any of these people, and I can't get it, right? So how do you highlight people's voices in this kind of context when you don't have the chance to have any more information? I'm thinking about if there is other information that I can get to complement that data that I already have, and if so, you know, what are the obvious gaps that would be helpful here? And also what kinds of collaborations are useful at this stage. Certainly there's this collaboration with the woman who did the interviews in the first place, who won't be writing about them, but who has weighed in here and there on certain aspects of what to do with some of the data. And like I said, you know, there's so many people here working on wonderful documentation projects. I think there's a lot to move forward with. And then again, the best format to publish and circulate the conclusions from this research. I'm a firm believer of, you know, things should have an academic contribution, but not be exclusively for an academic audience, especially when we're talking about voices and stories and narratives. There's got to be, you know, a bigger audience than just our academic colleagues. And I think in particular in these questions of displacement, there are certainly a lot of policy-specific questions as well. So these are the things I'm thinking about. I'm very curious to hear what this information made you think about. I'm happy to talk a little more, you know, if there are any of those interview questions I presented that you would like to hear more about some of the answers to, happy to talk about that. But I want to say thank you for listening. Here is the citation for Jennifer Carroll's essay. If you're interested in my book, that's the title, Information, and then some of those folks who I mentioned in the talk contributed to this volume, Dispossession, which was edited by Kathy Warner. It's open access on the Routledge website. You might see some other familiar names in there, but it's got a lot that I think addresses some of the same topics, so please, I hope you'll read some of those. And I'll turn it over for discussion. Thank you so much again for listening.
Thank you for sharing these wonderful details and these internal kitchens that we do not often see in the research. And я щаслива відкрити поле для...
And I'm happy to open the floor for comments, questions, for sharing your information, and we will follow the microphone principle, so you have to raise your hand, and since we do have interpretation, you have to speak to the microphone. Please raise your hand.
thank you, Emily. This is really fascinating. I have kind of a meta-methodological or ethical question. Is your university happy with you being here? And how does it work, the ethics procedure and the formal procedures? Because I'm based at a university in the EU, and to my knowledge, no university within the EU allows researchers to formally go to Ukraine.
Well, I'm technically not here for research. So.
You're on holidays. Yeah,
no, I'm here on a let's say administrative visit. No, I mean, I'm technically a researcher staff person at my university. I'm not a faculty person, so I don't have the same kind of expectations to follow the same procedures, so I have a little bit more freedom. So as far as I know, my university limits undergraduates from coming to Ukraine. I don't know what the story is with graduate students, but I understand that there are a lot of universities in the US are preventing students who intend to do research, especially longer term research, from actually coming to Ukraine to do that research, whether they won't pay for their insurance or they won't pass their institutional review board, right? So there are these kind of bureaucratic mechanisms, which I've been thinking about as well, because so this IRB for this research, because it was, you know, that little bracketed time frame, I haven't updated it to say that there's more research happening, because technically there's not. So I feel kind of okay working within what I have, but in terms of any future research, I'm not sure what they will do. Will they say, you know, it's unethical to do research during war? Will they say it's unethical or it's, you know, too dangerous for you and your subjects to do research, you know, something like that? I have no idea. I suppose I will find out, but I know from hearing some stories about people, there are some universities, I understand that the University of Ottawa, several PhD students from that university have been in Ukraine doing research, but that is the only one I know where multiple students have been able to come to Ukraine for any extended period of time, and most of the other stories are similar to these, you know, just visiting your friends, you know, that sort of thing. So, I mean, this isn't, I'm not doing research right now, right? So I feel like I'm living in that liminal space, but I don't know what will happen, you know, to pitch some kind of project. I wonder that too, I really do. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. And I wonder, I have two questions, I think. I wonder if you considered cooperating with Ukrainian journalists who covered the policymaking on IDPs, and maybe if you didn't, maybe we can think of something, because there were editors who were like covering, and certainly we have some contacts of people who were working in this reintegration or whatever ministries that are sometimes completely useless, sometimes they're okay, but some people change, and maybe we can get those contacts. And the second one is, did you consider coming back to those people you interviewed after 2022 and ask them what? Because I think there is a slight possibility that they moved again, this time abroad, possibly, because I have several friends, for example, who did that. So, and what limitations do you think there would be? Because my speculation would be that the events before 2022 would be covered in this fog, you know, of this full-scale invasion. Maybe these are going to be not the same testimonies that they have given.
Yeah. Thank you. I have a collection, so I have a lovely graduate student who was helping with that collection of policy information and collected a lot of stories kind of about what was happening, which I haven't really had a chance to engage with, but that would, you know, that's a great way to think about it. So I would love to, that's a path that I have not yet followed, but would certainly love to do that. And I am interested in kind of the press coverage of you know, what was happening, just to sort of see like how, you know, how these policies are talked about, and who are, you know, who are journalists talking to? Are they talking to a lot of IDPs, and if so, how are those people similar or different to the people in my interviews? I think that's a nice idea to give a little bit more of a holistic picture. And coming back to the people at 22 who I interviewed, Some of them, yes, are abroad. Some of them I was unable to get in touch with, which I understand. I mean, there were a couple of them who were living in Kramatorsk, for example, and I emailed once or twice and didn't get a response, and was like, this is not important. So that's kind of, so I was working together with a woman based in Kyiv who mostly now works on digitalization stuff. And she and I talk with regularity, but she was kind of involved in the project and not one of the collaborators, and has kind of moved on from that research. So all those connections that I was hoping would become, more long-term connections were really ruptured in a way that I didn't expect, and I struggled with, I didn't want to, put too much pressure on people to get back to me, right? I mean, at that point when I was emailing them, also it was like, March, April 2022, right? Like they have bigger concerns. And so I think probably it would be a good idea to follow up with folks from the international NGOs. I don't know if they're still in Ukraine or not, but that, that's something that would be a little less ethically ambiguous to me, where it's not like putting pressure on a Ukrainian person who's trying to, survive and evacuate their family, but it's like, I don't know, maybe they're still in Kyiv, maybe they're back in Copenhagen or something, right? And that's, thank you for the questions.
I will take the privilege of having a mic. And sorry, you also have it. So.
Good evening. Thank you for the talk. And my question is about the method and about how should we ask questions in this situation when those questions, and even if they're important for our study, they can bring up the events of trauma and re-traumatize the interviewee. And yet, those questions should be important. How should we manage that situation?
This is such an important question. So, like I said, I didn't. So the interviews that I did myself in 2021 were with professionals who worked with IDPs. So I felt a little bit more okay asking those questions. But it's interesting that you bring this up, because I just listened to an interview that the person who did this huge set of interviews, she was interviewing somebody who had been in captivity, and she stopped the interview because of how difficult it was, and it was really insightful to me, because as a non-native speaker, and I wasn't in the room, and I don't know what body language might have held. This woman did not sound that distressed, right? She's telling these stories. They're going off on tangents. She's going all over the place, and she keeps saying, I'm sorry, I keep losing my train of thought. I don't know what I'm talking about. And the interviewer says, I'm stopping the interview. This is clearly upsetting. And it was such a good lesson for me moving forward. And I think, like, I want to share this story, because she didn't even ask the woman, are you okay? She was just like, we're stopping the interview. And it wasn't, nothing the woman herself was saying was so traumatic, but it was clearly that the question of what happened in captivity and how did you escape had, she's fully in the interview, she says, no, I want to talk about it, I want to tell you the story, and then she can't do it, right? And so I guess the question is, how do you know when somebody, especially if you're not doing your traditional ethnography where you know people, you know how they react normally, and you can more easily tell if they're upset. If you're talking to people that you don't really know, how do you know that they are actually reacting in a way that has brought some trauma response? And it surprised me in this interview, because so many of the other interviews described things that to me seemed more traumatizing. And those people are just telling the story, and they're telling it, and they tell the whole story, right? And it's very straightforward, like, then we did this, and then we did this, and then we, and I think that was this woman who was just unable to get anywhere with what she was trying to say. That's not something I would have expected, and I don't know if that's, a common indicator of someone having a response to a traumatic experience. So I guess the answer to the question is, we need, as researchers, to be prepared to protect the people who are telling us stories, right? So we need to be able to jump in and say, okay, this interview's over, because it needs to be over, right? Without making the person giving the interview feel badly that they're damaging the project somehow, right? but I don't know, I don't know how we know that, right? Like I was never trained in that as an ethnographer. Maybe that's something that I've heard in some panels more recently. Ukrainian researchers are actually bringing up this conversation about like, we need to have psychologists on our team, but we also need to work with those psychologists so that we know how to interact with our interviewees better. But at the same time, like you say, these are really important questions, and a lot of times they are things that people want to talk about. And in this particular interview, this woman says, I want to talk about my experience, and then she can't, she can't do it. I feel like I'm not giving you a good answer. I don't really know. I don't think it's something we're tremendously prepared for. But I do think we need to think about it. Personally, I think non-Ukrainian researchers who want to do research like this in Ukraine need to talk to our Ukrainian colleagues who have more experience than we do with this type of documentation project, and follow that lead instead of thinking our research questions are the most important ones, right? Like they're not always. But at the same time, this documentation itself it's essential. We know that the record that it creates is an essential contribution to how we think about everything. You're welcome to add something. I feel like I haven't really answered it, but I'm thinking about it a lot, so I really appreciate that you, that you asked that.
So, I'm thinking about like key position to the question, especially so in my case I'm kind of starting because my subject is transformative experiences, and those, like by definition, include some of the extreme experiences. So I didn't think that for the foreigners are in a better position because they cannot know, but I could know some of those experiences. So you can just ask straight questions like you your first time.
Right.
So I see that tactic.
Yeah. I mean, I've used that tactic before, right? Like that's one of my favorite ethnographic tactics. I don't know what that means. I'm a dumb foreigner, right? Like tell me what lustration is, right? Because that way you get the person who you're talking to, you get their definition of the thing. You might have your official definition. I know what lustration is, right? Because there's a ton of ethnographic research about it. But I don't know what this guy who is talking to me about it thinks that it is. So I like that tactic. But I'm wary to use it. I'm really curious for anybody else's kind of take on that question because that's a great
Just one
thought.
addition.
Yeah.
My question here is, should you, because as a human being we can kind of see where the real answer is, and in terms of those stories you told me about on YouTube, for example, when people just straightforward telling things, those things seems like very produced, but they were already produced inside, and those are narratives formed. But as a researcher, I can, in the situation, I can see the real answer. And should I cross that line? And I definitely can tell that that's the traumatic experience. Should I go further there and really get the data? That's the kind of ethical question, you know?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
But without those things, you will only get the mediatized and pre-produced service. So.
I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's a really important question, and I think it might be individual. I think we all might kind of have to decide for ourselves what position we're comfortable with taking there. But I bet everyone else in the room might have a totally different answer. So yeah, thank you for bringing that to the discussion.
I have plenty of questions, but I will limit myself to just one, and maybe then, if we still have time, I can put more. About this data set that you inherited somehow, and this multiple relations with this data set, but especially these limits of anonymity. And all these inner tensions that you might have in your profession as ethnographer, as someone who is given voice, not to a nameless person, but to a real human being. How do you deal with this tension of working with anonymized data set, and to what extent is it actually anonymized? Because we are in our documentation are also facing this discussion that sometimes the name of your pet could de-anonymize you. especially if you are from Svoboda party from Donetsk,
Right.
I guess it's not such a huge group of people.
Yeah.
So it's quite easy to trace a person based on his or her age and position, and like so many details that so easy de-anonymize you.
Yep.
So to what extent actually you are working with anonymized collection, and what is the tension between giving voice and anonymity, especially if we are talking about the current war, but it's another big question.
So I actually have been grappling with it. I'll do the second part first and then go back to the giving voice question. There are definitely some interviews where I am like, I could figure this out, and I don't know if it is the, so far I have not. But like, for instance, one of the interviewees is a woman MP from one of those regions. I know I could find that woman based on how old she is and what town she's from. Probably with just what I told you, you could probably figure it out too, right? Like, it's definitely not that hard for some of them. But I don't, so my attitude right now is I don't want to treat any of the interviews differently. So I don't want to try to find out more about that person, which will then take away from random man who drives car, you know, he has a car service in Kiev with no political experience. You know, I don't want to act like this MP is more important than car service man who, you know, very, like, I'm not political, all, you know, very, like, totally kind of different attitude toward everything. And I want to give equal weight to those. I think this is a question that I am going, once I'm finished with the whole data set, I would like to return with the interviewer and speak with her and ask her if there is anybody in particular who she would be okay with me talking to, or if she might be interested in following up with somebody, in which case some of that anonymity would go away. She may say no. I think that has to be her decision. I mean, she personally knows a couple of people. She grew up in Horlivka, like she knew some of them. So I know that she, you know, they're not anonymous to her in the way that they are for me, but I think I have to leave it up to her to decide if that's something that she's comfortable with. And if she says no, then I think I'll remain at the same level of anonymity for everyone, right? Like, not try to find out more. But that leads me to the second problem. I mean, I think this is one of my real hang-ups about it. How can I give voice if I don't know anything about these people, right? Like, it's just, I think these things seem like they're at odds. How do you give voice when all you have is literally that voice? It's totally disembodied. That is something that as an ethnographer trained in like very traditional U.S. sociocultural anthropology, it is just, I don't know what to do, and I feel like it's not enough to just say, well, here's what people say, right? Like, I feel like I feel an obligation that there has to be more, and I don't know, I mean, that's probably a personal problem, but I think maybe a lot of us might grapple with this question when we're dealing specifically with this kind of giving voice problem. So that I think leads, to go back to your framework, like, is the anonymity itself limiting the story and the data because it is so anonymous? And then is it appropriate to just say, like, okay, well, this is what this guy said about starting a car service in Kiev? Isn't that interesting? I mean, I think it's fascinating, but yeah.
I mean, if I can jump into that, because it's like really like the quote that you gave of Jennifer Carroll. It's about story, and you have this anonymity, how you produce this, how you create the story, and it's a part, that on one hand you have this, different, your different choices, because if you can't, have the voice to be heard and to reconstruct the story of a person, and from which you do that, like, all the limits, it's so hard to relate to that story, to the person, to relate person to person. And then kind of you just almost kind of, it's a brutal metaphor, like mince them into the themes and questions and arguments. And that's probably the price of paying for the anonymity. But on the other hand, I just was also wondering, if respecting the anonymity, there is another way of going and kind of, partly fictionalizing, because you have quite a rich data. And usually as historians, we don't get that number of personal details in the archive. But you still, like, and kind of how you could, respecting anonymity, still reconstruct a personality. And then, give the, I don't know, so that's where this is line with academic and telling the story and relating, and then actually what you want from the work. So I'm just hoping I have some questions, but there is a line about that.
Yeah, do you want to answer?
No, go ahead, and I wrote some notes, I'll think about it a little bit.
I have one that I wanted to mention at the very beginning. When you talked about that we don't see the other side of the story, we don't always have to. I think this war is showing us that, specifically the TIFF Festival right now, the movie that's come out in Canada, we are not necessarily in a position where we need to tell the stories of evil, all right? And as someone who works with the Western mentality in the same way as you do, we have been trained to present both sides of the story. Sometimes there isn't the other side of the story. And I don't think we are coming to that stage where we are starting to understand that. And perhaps we need to talk more about that fact. The other thing is when you choose people that you're interviewing or not interviewing, as someone who's working quite a bit with individuals here today in Ukraine, I do think that one of the questions that needs to be posed is, have you worked with a psychologist? Do you have someone that you're working with? They will react differently when you're conducting an interview. If they have worked with someone, if they're happy with who they've worked with, of course that's part of it. But if they have received support, help, they will respond differently to the kinds of questions that you present, and so I really would support that. When I listen to some of these interviews, I see the parallels that have occurred not only with internally displaced persons, but also with those who have left the country, and also those who left Ukraine following the Second World War. Some of the experiences of the displaced persons who left after the Second World War, just for your information, when interviews were conducted with them, some of these interviews were put into archives until the person passed. There is a system, specifically in Canada, where people can sign a declaration saying, I am providing you with this information, but you may not use it until I have passed, my spouse has passed. There's different ways of doing these things. We are then able to get information which we otherwise would not be able to get. Yes, we are limited in the time frame. We can't do it right away, but it doesn't, like, it's there, and that's important.
There was at some point in this data set an idea to create a digital archive, and there's actually a specific question of consent in some of the interviews, and when I say some, I mean 3 or so out of 80, so it's a minimal number, where she has clearly thought through this idea of making this digital archive, and people say, yes, please put my story up. And some people say, please share my story, like, tell your friends in Poland, this is what they need to know. So there's a lot of really enthusiastic support for the idea of sharing, and then some people, as you might suspect, say things like, actually, can you maybe not talk about this thing that I told you because I think maybe I overshared. So thankfully, I mean, not a surprise to me at all, this interviewer really made it so that it was easy for me to know what the confines are based on what that particular interviewee says. So I think that's something to revisit with her later on. I've decided, so I have, like I mentioned, a graduate student who's working with me on some of this, and for example, I decided not to let her see any of the transcripts of the people who were in Svoboda Party, because a lot of what they did, some of those stories are beyond questionable legality, let's say. And they're interesting and they're important, but I think there are certain stories that I need a little more caution with, and others that are well enough anonymized that I think I don't mind one person, looking in this and getting some more eyes on the data. So I've already kind of thought about that a little bit, but I think, what to do with that and what to do with that archive and accessibility are really big questions that I do plan to address kind of again and again and again with the woman who did the interviews. She does sometimes ask people if they've worked with a psychologist, or sometimes they'll say, Caritas has all these services, and then they give a list, and she says, have you talked to one of the psychologists? And they'll say, yes, or they'll say, no, I didn't, but I took my kid there, right? And so she does such a great job of like following some of those threads that make you feel like this question has been addressed. But I think in terms of the the previous question about what, do we ask people those questions, like that's a kind of groundwork to understand for the person how they might respond. So, and thank you for the first comment about we don't actually always have to see both sides. I think that's a crucial thing to say. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really fascinating to listen to this discussion as well. I really also just want to say a short comment. I really like what you said about this supposed objective reality not being that important maybe when it comes to telling stories also, because I think it's a nice kind of purposeful anthropological approach rather than a historian, the historian one. And if possible, I would really like to hear a little bit more about the contents of the interviews that you analyzed, specifically whether they touched upon the topic of home as a concept, and whether there were like specific conceptual or perhaps even material factors mentioned that would help people recreate this feeling of home once they're displaced, or perhaps hinder this recreation.
Yeah. Yes. I'm just noting because I think that's a good thing to think about. So one of the things that honestly made me the most sort of sad was the way people talked about stuff they left behind, and it was usually, there's this one story in particular where this woman talks about she just bought this couch. And it was perfect, and it fit in her room, and they would sit on it and watch TV, and she's like, I know this is stupid. We're safe, we have a place to live, we have hot water, I know this is stupid, but I miss my couch. And it's stuff like that, right, that like puts you in that mode of thinking, I have everything I need, and like, this woman did nothing to right, it just, that's the stuff that for me was just gripped me in a way that, I don't know, I still obviously, like, I don't know how to deal with it, but some of those things that it's like, the thing that to me about that answer that's most interesting is the way people always frame it is like, I know that's a stupid thing to care about. I know it doesn't matter. I know I'm grateful for being alive, right? They couch it in this very like, I'm overreact, like they put themselves down by thinking that they care about the couch, right? And so that kind of thing, I think that's a theme I want to go back to, is these material, I mean, these are people who left their parents, right? Like, my dad is too ill to come down the stairs, so we had to leave, right? Like, and they talk about that in an emotional and empathetic way, but somehow it's the things that tie them to home have to do not with necessarily anything that changes. It's to do, I think, with the things that stay the same. A lot of people talk about apartments and like physical spaces that they made their own. And then a lot of people also talk about what they've done in their new spaces to make it feel more like home. And I think that's the other side of the question that you asked. Some of them say like, oh, I started to hang art on the walls, or, I bought this particular thing and it was great because it was the first thing I added. Little things like that, or like, this place was in really bad repair and then I came and cleaned it up and now we feel like we can live in it. So there are a lot of stories like that. They're a little less specific and a little bit less tangible than the couch. Or, people went back to get their pets. That's one those stories are really like moving and touching to me, because a lot of those pets didn't survive also, and so there's stories like that. But there are, one of the most like weirdly amusing things is that there are a lot of dogs in the interviews. Like they come with the person and then they like make a little noise in the background. It's amazing. So there's I think multiple elements of that answer, right? Like there's the material things left behind. There's the people and the loved ones and the companions and the animals that are all left behind. Then there's the things that were brought with that are reminders of home, and then there's that process of reinvesting in a new home. So that, I wouldn't necessarily say that the concept comes up in the term of home, but I think it would be curious to go back at those, then look at those discussions and look specifically at the language that people use to describe what makes something feel, like their own. I think it's more own, right? Like my own thing. and which I think is indicative of the process of displacement, of being, you know, forcibly removed from the space that was clearly your own to a space that's not your own at all, and then making it somehow your own, that transformative experience of like ownness. Yeah, so yeah, that's great to know that that theme like kind of comes up. Yeah, I'm gonna look at it more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. This was fascinating to get to hear what you're working on. And you asked us to weigh in, so Emily, you said, you know, thinking about like what the contribution is.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there's a real contribution, even if you said that this data is not representative.
Mm-hmm.
I do think there's a real contribution with talking about people who are displaced for these political reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just been really enjoying this conversation, and I was thinking like, that's its own little world, that's its own little niche, that's its own little ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's the story.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of our traditional, because I'm also an ethnographer, instead of our traditional bringing the sort of biography to life, I wonder if you could reconstruct the world that they were living in. I just really loved your contribution about home, and so I wonder if there's a way that through all of these different stories, assuming that they're very different because you don't have this data, you know, even though they have these similarities of being in this world that was existing in Donetsk or in the other places they were coming from, I wonder if you could pick it as themes, but not just themes, you know, for the sake of picking themes, but themes around this idea of reconstructing the world that they were coming from, and if that's the kind of context, because I know for, you know, anthropology, it's all about that context. I wonder if there's something about if you can't reconstruct the individual biography, if you can reconstruct that world that they represented, and that it feels so ephemeral, like even so much has changed since 2022. And then I was curious about your thoughts on that, and I don't have this is something to think more about, because I don't know the answer to my own question here, but I was wondering if that's how some of our colleagues who are historical anthropologists do it, because they're sort of trying to bridge between establishing that historiography and the truth of what happened, while also bringing in the, you know, it doesn't have to be real to have real consequences thing that we love in anthropology. So I just was curious about your thoughts on some of that.
I mean, it leads me to the idea of, you know, it doesn't matter if it was real for everyone. If it was real for somebody, then that already is important enough. And I don't want that part of the story to get lost. I really feel like the way, in the U.S. context, the way Ukraine gets politicized and so many misperceptions about Eastern Ukraine. I mean, anyone who doesn't know anything about Ukraine in the U.S. has no idea about any of this stuff in these interviews, and that alone makes me think that just describing the world, and some of these people are describing in absolutely great detail. Just like they went to some Independence Day, or what did they do? An alternative Independence Day in Donetsk, and they did a concert, and they did this, and there were kids' games, and for whatever reason, that image just is in itself to me significant, and the fact that somebody remembered this thing, and that why do people answer a question in the way that they answer it? Like, what about that question brings up something important to them? I mean, that's already interesting to see what they think is important, what has imprinted on their minds as essential, or that, that is emblematic of the city of Donetsk in 2012, Alternative Independence Day, right? And I just think that's, I really like that idea of kind of focusing on world building rather than I have to tell this X person story, which is, I mean, if any of you do end up reading my book, that's a huge departure from what I did before, and I think that's kind of my, it's a difficulty, right? It's really difficult to go from knowing, really intimately knowing people and devoting a whole chapter to, just people's biographies, and then having gone back and read the first version to those people to get them to weigh in on what has changed and what they want to add, right? It's a totally different process. So it's very validating to hear some of these thoughts and ideas, and I really like that, so thank you very much.
Thanks for this amazing talk. And I was just wondering about this whole topic of getting 80 interviews, not conducting them, not being in the field yourself. I'm just really wondering, how do you kind of navigate this kind of absence of the field work, the absence of actually being able to build this kind of close relationships and get to know people, get some non-verbal signs and all these things.
Yeah.
So how do you actually navigate this? And the second question is also, how do you kind of position yourself in relation to this interviews and in relation to the research? Also, like, without the fieldwork itself and conducting these interviews. Thank you.
Thank you. So I initially started, I started to get students doing the transcripts, and I started out just reading the transcripts, and I realized, first I realized they had made mistakes, and I had to go back and find corrections. And then I was doing one of the corrections, and there was this woman who was telling this story, or she was talking about, you know, I don't know, her escape and how she was so mad and she was going to cut off the heads of the separatists and carry them around on pitchforks, and I was like, oh my god, I can't believe she said that. I go back in the interview and I'm listening to her, and she's laughing. She's like, I'm going to go carry their heads on pitchforks. And I was like, what am I missing by not listening to these interviews? I thought I could just go through I was missing so much. And it was really interesting to discover that even without the actual nonverbal bodily cues, I could get so much more from the story just by listening to the person tell the story. So that was the main, so what I decided to do was, despite the fact that it took, and it is taking tons of time, I am listening to every single second of every single interview because I think it's the only way. And even, you know, I was telling the story of the woman who was in captivity, and I didn't really get the cues that she was having a very traumatized response. But in a lot of them, you know, people are so emotive when they talk, and so there's so much depth to the interview. So I started to take a lot of notes about how someone is telling the story, because I think, and one of the other things I noted was, you know, people will tell these stories, really upsetting, traumatizing stories, and they just tell it, they just tell the story. And so it's also notable to me how people talk about what they're talking about. So I was actually kind of surprised at the depth I felt like I had been able to access despite not having done the interviews myself, and that was a kind of like pleasant, positive thing that made me feel kind of closer to these people, even though I don't know them at all. The positionality question is also really interesting. I didn't quite frame it like this, but in my first book, I was doing research on political activism and how people were relating to the state in this idea, you know, in a democracy, right? Like the state represents citizens, citizens vote for state representatives. We have this obligation of the state to take care of people. And so I was kind of interested in displacement as an example of a kind of rupture around that. And I had started thinking, I mean, I don't even know how I got this. It's truly like a luck question. I was at a conference in Vinnytsia in 2019, and I was like talking to somebody about my interest in this topic, and she was like, hey, I know somebody who has all these interviews. Let me put you in touch, and maybe she'll share some of them. And so I kind of approached it from this really conceptual angle, and then ended up with this data set that has really, I mean, it has confirmed some of what I thought, but it has also really shifted what I think the priorities are. One of the things I plan to navigate in the kind of future writing process is how present the interviewer herself wants to be. I think, I mean, obviously I owe her everything, right? Should she be a co-author? Does she want to be a co-author? You know, should her name be on the cover? Does she want it to be on the cover? Like, does she want that kind of recognition? You know, or like, what's her, I want to make sure that her comfort level is kind of respected given how her relationship with this data is. But I kind of, I mean, I think it's, I mean, it's a weird positionality, right? To be like, I am not the most important person in this research, right? Like, I almost don't matter in the story, but I think in terms of, you know, being able to see a different picture than what she would have necessarily seen, that's important. So that's gonna, for me, the positionality question is less about me and more about where she kind of fits into that story, since she did most of the interview work and then thusly directs the conclusions of the work. But I think it's, you know, I think it's an important, yeah, question. It'll be in my really extensive methodology chapter. It's very long.
Okay, so you mentioned methodology, and I'm just curious, because knowledge production is really a diverse field and very hierarchical. There are certain things that, you know, have more presence, or if you say value, and others are less present. Like, you know, if you're, you know, going to archive and gathering informations and then sending it like a research assistant, you know, that's, or, you know, if you have this methodological innovation, it's like kind of more cool. And then you have theoretical conceptualization. It's, oh my gosh, that's really cool, right? So, and we do have this different, knowledge production cultures, you know, more descriptive, more analytical, more interpretative, some value more, some, you know, are more prominent. So you mentioned that, you know, right now we are looking for that possible shift. And you said that, you know, this contribution of scholars from Ukraine are in methodologies. And you know, how do you see in your perception? Because so these are methodologies slightly less than theories, or kind of the same, but just of a different kind. And you know, so this is just generally not only about who gets what, but also what is how relation is changing between those, you know, data, methodology, theory, trinity, right? And then, you know, emplacement, I do like it a lot, but also I'm just curious of what happens with the place, because you just follow what people bring into and how they encounter. And, you know, the chronology of your sources make them slightly historical already, right? So I'm just wondering, because, you know, it's like integration. There's no integration that something is moving and something is stable. There's no like emplacement. So both are changing. Everything is changing. And maybe, I don't know, maybe as a thought, maybe like oral history can step into, I don't know. And the way thinking about this period, which already seems historical, not because of time, but because of what happened in 22, right? So like maybe look for oral history of people who were whose neighbors were IDP, I don't know, not only this local, so I think it's a good thing to look into politics, not only policies on the top level, but at the local SNAP. So this is the Administrative Service Office. And like kind of ask people what was 10 years ago, like how things were 10 years ago. So it might be less, I don't know, to remember, to recall, but also look for people in the cities, I don't know, Dnipro, Kyiv, and Lviv, who happen to have neighbors who were IDPs in some way, like kind of how place changed from the other side. So I just was wondering around that. I was also thinking about this world making that you mentioned, and I thought, you know, there are many words. And there's also this sense of this what happened 22, like the sense that this loss that puts you into nostalgia and that kind of isolates it and kind of makes it whole, right? The world that is insular in some way. So, and then my question would be not rather like observation, but the problem of your data, it's not a problem, but it's a limit that it's not representative, but rather how not to make it insular of other experiences. But also whether either these interviews, there are windows or doors or, you know, cracks into other worlds, right? So maybe also like, so not to make it ideal in a way that it's closed, that it's polished. And I don't know, I mean, I'm kind of, you know, I'm not sure, I think that, what are other stories thinking? Are the stories the story of what is in Russia now? What's the story of Ukrainian citizens who have different opinions, or have different experience, or have different attitude? And basically, can we have them now, or can we get them now and have them later? Right. So this is the question. And I think that really what is more generally that using the data, in this case it's very special, like because you were like inheriting. But I think it's also like using the data which is not which is not, how to say it in English, that's not only yours. And here Natalia knows quite well, because in our oral history archive tried also to get materials from people who use it for their one book, and then somebody else can write something else, because I think it just makes the interpretation of what people share, their experience, richer, more eyes look into them, but it also kind of that people are not exploited to tell again and again, so it kind of give more of attention to the testimony. The more people look into that, so how you share your sources, and how you not keep, I don't think, exclusionary about that it's mine and not yours. Right. And we tend to do that, but in anthropology and in history with our archives, we kind of do that from time to time. But so thank you so much. It's really incredible how you thread through these complex stories and sources and sharing.
Yeah, thank you for that insight, and I mostly took notes. I don't think a lot of those things have answers, but one thing I wanted to say is that I had a colleague actually who mentioned to me, you know, a lot of people do like a book workshop, right? They like circulate their books with other colleagues and get comments, and he suggested having a methodological workshop, share the material, have everybody pull their own analysis into that, and I was like, that's an amazing idea. And that's why I started sharing it, even with my graduate student who's not an anthropologist. Like, she's not really trained in the same methods as me, but it's just so fascinating to get anybody else's insight on it. And so I think, you know, I have a very strong position that I think research is better when you take your time. And so I feel, despite the fact that this research has already taken like a lot more time than I expected, I think it's worth doing things like that, doing exercises like that are out of the norm, you know, because I just think like my student who was transcribing interviews had absolutely no reference point for certain place names in Eastern Ukraine. She spelled them wrong. I had to Google them. I'd go down these rabbit holes. There's this cyclist who does these long bike tours around Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and like he goes to all these places. Anyway, that's a serious rabbit hole. You know, but like, it was so interesting to me that she didn't even know she'd never even heard of them, right? And so then I'm trying to Google them, see like what place is this? Oh, someone's using the pre-2015 name, someone's insisting on using the changed name that the people there don't even recognize, right? So there's all these layers that I can find with having no reference point. So imagine someone who has more of a reference point reading the same material and the layers they would peel back. And so that's the kind of thing I was thinking about. And it was precisely about this like territoriality about data. It was me kind of coming to terms with the fact that I have no ownership of this data, right? It is part of my world right now, and it's actually better, and the analysis becomes richer if more people see it. It's not proprietary to me, and I think anthropologists are really bad about that. We are so territorial, and it's bad. It's not helpful. And I'm hopeful. I see in my colleagues who work in Ukraine, that's obviously, I'm very biased because those are the people I spend the most time with, but I see among a small group of us a lot more collaborative effort, kind of knowing that our work is stronger if we help each other, but also that we're all doing really different things and we're not actually stepping on each other's toes. And so that has also helped me think there is space for this. And I do also feel like some of that's coming out, especially in the articles that I've reviewed about these methodological questions coming from Ukraine. Most of them are co-written. Most of them are not single author, right? So that means that this methodological contribution and shift is also coming from this collaborative space, which I think actually also helps with dealing with the psychological components of these challenging questions. We are not sitting here by ourselves with our data. So I think actually all of that goes together. And just that one final comment, I've always actually had a problem with the notion that producing theory is somehow better than methodology. I've always been, my favorite chapter is always the methods chapter. I love reading about how people came to their data. And that's for me like going to college and reading my first ethnography, and it had a spectacular methods chapter, and I was like, this is what I want to do, But I really respect people who are willing to say, I had to wade through a lot of challenges and I didn't know how to get to where I ended up. And I took my time thinking about it and wasn't just like, well, this is what I want to know and here's how I know what I already wanted to know. You lose so much when you don't let people tell the story that they want to tell. So anyway, to me, this kind of methodological innovation, I want to make sure that is part of this story that's being told, and that it fits in that conversation that's happening here. Because I love that conversation. I think it's so important. I think it deals with so many things that researchers, we get really set in our ways. We think this is how you do. You gotta go. You start from X and you gotta get to Y, and that's the story. And it doesn't have to be like that. And I really think we're all better off if there's this kind of collaborative mechanism to our methods. So I don't know. Maybe that's like very rose-colored glasses. Like we can all get along and work together, but it's my ideal.
It's a lovely point to end. But if you have any last question, anyone.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on the question of the sort of emotional realism rather than like objective realism, and it's a little bit related to the question about what stories are legitimate or what stories are the other stories. This is just for the context, I come from within journalism studies, where actors is extremely important, but I also think it's a beautiful very anthropological approach to show the emotional realism of people. At the same time, in the last couple of months, I read a couple of draft papers written by Russian scholars who wrote about the alleged Ukrainian journalists who had to allegedly flee to Russia because they were persecuted by Ukraine. And they presented it citing the exact same approach. So I was wondering, where is the boundary, like where this story is relevant and where it's not relevant, where it's where the accuracy matters and where it doesn't matter. And also we have this this film, Russians at War, where the documentarist is actually having the same approach, presenting stories of ordinary Russians who insist that they didn't commit any war crimes. So I was wondering, what is it? Is it your positionality or political position, or is it your identity of an ethnographer or anthropologist that distinguishes you from journalists or documentary filmmakers, or what is it that makes a difference and that makes us accept this approach?
I think this is a really especially good question, because I honestly think it wouldn't be the last time, it won't be the last time I hear this question unless I justify it really well, right? It's a super question. I don't think I know the answer. You have to be able to distinguish between what is analytically valuable and why. I think you have to be able to justify why something, I don't know. I'm thinking of the example that I mentioned, many people say, people who came to occupy the Donetsk regional administration building, they were foreigners, and here, they're from Russia, here's how we know, right? And they give certain examples of they didn't know where it was, and then they got lost, and then this, these sort of things. And to me, right, not being a journalist, I don't have any experience with journalism, so journalists tell me if this is a total, unfair distinction, or a non-existent distinction, right? But I would say there are enough different people who tell this story who don't know each other, in all these anonymized interviews, they're completely separate, they're telling it in, full years apart in totally different cities. At that point, that story comes up enough that it seems to me to have some validity. There is other data out there that corroborates a lot of what they're saying. I could theoretically find some external citations that at least would lend credibility to those stories. But I think, if you think about it, in that question, it seems to me like there's a reasonable foundation to say, I think this person is not intentionally lying about this story. When we're talking about something like, telling stories about Donetsk in 2013 and 2012, that's a little different in some ways, because it is very partial. I mean, somebody who was more of a pro-Russian political position would have a completely different experience. So, and it does have that nostalgic element, right? People are only remembering things that, I mean, that's how memory works, right? Memory is so inconsistent and so imperfect, you know. That's the sort of story where I feel like you get a little bit more flexibility, where it doesn't have to be true, but it also doesn't have that political intention behind it. It's just somebody telling a story of how they lived in the city that they lived in, and it goes back to Christina's idea of, like, you know, building the world that people lived in. We know that there are cracks in that world, and they're mentioned, and I think you can indicate that people say, like, well, you know, there was this business element, but I wasn't involved in that. I went to Ukrainian literary readings, and here's what that experience was like. So I think there's a way to kind of present a recognition that other universes exist. That's just not what we're talking about right now, which is, hopefully the stakes for that are lower than those examples that you're talking about, where there is that kind of intentionality of, like, shifting people's opinion behind it. Like, I guess for me the line is, like, what's information and what's information that enriches how we see something versus the intention to change people's perspective on something. That's a very fuzzy line. I mean, it's not a real line, right? But this is it's a great question. I don't think there's a clear answer. If anyone else has, like, rules of how to distinguish, I would be curious to see, especially in journalism, how that's distinguished. But I mean, for me, it would, yeah, I think it would maybe be a kind of case, you know, a case of what the type of story that's being told, or, like, what the conclusions are, you know, what's the intention behind them, what's the intention behind that story, which I also can't totally know because I can't go back and ask people, so it's, you know, yeah, I think it's tough to navigate. But
I guess it's great that you have so many questions.
Yes, I love that.
It's a great sign of the event, a successful event, is when you have more questions after it than you had before, and we definitely have them. And I also think we have a wonderful example of how to work across the ruptures. These multiple ruptures, and how can we return to the sources which were created before this huge rupture of the year 2022, and how can we reassess them in relation to the present, but also not in this very linear approach, and think about this reality behind the sources. And if you allowed me also to work and make this connection to your book that you will possibly read here at the center, one of the ending lines that you have, and they are deeply resonating for me and to the topic that we have today, the topic of home. And the line is, I think of everything my friends are doing, and it reminds me that we must continue to fight however we can. They just want to return home, to Kyiv or whatever home is. I can't wait until that day comes. And actually we cannot wait until the day comes that people will return to the homes that they left for various reasons. And I'm cordially inviting you. І зараз я переходжу на українську і нагадаю вам про чудову виставку повернення Владимира Пухальського, яка знаходиться.
Let me remind you that we have Vladimir Puchalsky exhibition in the Art Center in Lviv, but there is also a public agenda that is coming behind it, that is coming on the 19th of September, and we will be talking about return, but return home. So I'm inviting you to the discussion, and please follow the pages of the Center for Urban History, and let's once again express our gratitude to Emily for her perfect lecture and interactive discussion.